Hello and welcome to the RotoWire WNBA show, where we talk about fantasy basketball. I'm Jason Shebilske alongside Kirien Sprecher. Today, we'll recap some of the biggest news from around the WNBA this week. We'll also offer some of our favorite players to add before the Olympic break. And finally, we'll preview some of our favorite matchups taking place before the All Star break. Those looking to test RotoWire's full slate of tools can visit rotowire.com/try for a free trial. If you have questions during the show, you can ask them in the comments and we'll get them answered. If they're asked live, we'll talk about them on the show, but you can also ask them afterward and we'll get them answered in the comments. Kieran, there have been several big stories around the WNBA as we enter the final few days before the regular season suspends for both the All-Star break and Olympic break. What are some of the biggest stories you'll be following over the next few days?
I think it's just a couple of injuries, right? Shakira Austin has been out for a long time, and she's just been dealing with that hip injury all season. And then you have Collier's recent plantar fasciitis. Both teams are still like treating them as day to day, but they haven't therefore they haven't given like a return timetable, which is kind of frustrating. Collier has been doubtful the last couple games. It doesn't feel like she's going to play before the All-Star break. There would be really no reason to with where Minnesota's at in the standings. Austin is a different case. Mystics haven't been great. They just had a good win over the Fever, so maybe they can fight for a playoff spot if they get healthy in the second half. But I feel like my assumption is both these players are going to be back after the Olympic break. Like, look, this is like a month-long break. Both of these players are considered day-to-day. And if they aren't back, we should get like a substantial update, like they're out for the season, which would be terrible in both situations. And I don't expect that. So I'm expecting both of these players to be back. So like maybe make a trade for Collier if you can. Maybe like try to pick up Austin if she was dropped, or trade for Austin. But I feel like that could be a really risky assumption, but I think it could really pay off in the end.
Yeah, I think that these are very high risk, high upside moves, especially with Shakira Austin. We really don't know. It sounds like her recovery process has been really inconsistent. So some good days, some bad days. But I think, especially with the way that the Mystics have approached injuries in recent seasons, we saw it with Elena Deladon and some other players. They seem like a team that wants to make sure that their players are fully healthy before getting back into action. And especially sitting near the bottom of the standings, it makes sense for them. It seems to me that, like, even if Shakira Austin is cleared to return in mid-August after the Olympic break, she could still have minutes restrictions down the stretch, which would be really frustrating for fantasy managers because she's a really efficient one on the court, but she just hasn't had the playing time to make a huge fantasy impact this year. Collier feels like a different story. Because of the way that Cheryl Reeve has talked about it, it sounds like they're just kind of managing her workload ahead of the Olympic break, and that it isn't like a multi-month injury that we have to be concerned about, which is really good news. And especially with where the Lynx are, it feels like they will probably want to get Collier back to full work as soon as possible. And that would probably be mid-August, or maybe even a game or two before the Olympics if she heals fast enough.
Yeah, and honestly, even if Austin is like limited, she was putting up pretty solid fantasy points like while being limited. So you don't probably not like top 10 player, top 15 player in the second half. But if she's playing 20 to 25 minutes, like I think she's a solid like must start player. And honestly, if you've had Austin on your roster so far this season, you're probably not at the top of your standings. You're probably like, oh, I got to make a move. I got to get some solid production. So I think you could buy really low. And then even if she's limited, you could still like gain that value back.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially because this next week, I think in standard ESPN fantasy leagues, it'll be the final week of the regular season. So spanning first half of this week, and then when we return from the Olympic break, that'll be 1 week, but that'll be it before the playoffs. So if you need a move, Austin could be someone that after the Olympic break is able to contribute, but just be prepared for a minutes restriction if she is back. We also, on Monday, previewed this week's game between the Liberty and the Sun, and the Wednesday morning matchup didn't disappoint. The Liberty appeared to have the upper hand for most of the game, but the Sun had a few surges to help keep them in the matchup. However, the Liberty still secured a 3-point victory. I was really impressed in this game by how well New York held Alyssa Thomas in check, as Thomas had a season low 3 points in the loss. She was still productive in points and rebounds, but it was encouraging to see the Liberty be able to hold her in check. What stood out to you?
Well, before we get to the actual game itself, let's talk about why this game was played so early on a Wednesday afternoon. That was really silly in my opinion, but the game was excellent. I feel like what stood out the most is New York's big three or big four, if you want to include Courtney Vandersloot, showed their championship tested, right? Look, they lost in the finals last year to the Aces. It wasn't particularly close, but they've been to back-to-back Commissioners Cup championships, winning last year and then losing this year. So like this team has been in all three of the last like championship games, right? Like this team knows how to play in those games. They haven't won all of them, but they're championship tested, right? And so this game going up against the Sun, a championship contender, they just showed that they have that championship resolve and stymied any comebacks that the Connecticut would have potentially had. Like against a lesser team, Connecticut probably drops, comes back and then like steals that game like on some, like good run in the fourth quarter because they're just a better team. But New York is like, we're not at our best, but when push comes to shove, our best players, Sabrina Ionescu, Brianna Stewart, Jonquel Jones, they're going to step up and make plays when needed. And they did in this game. And I felt like, even on a Wednesday afternoon, it takes like a little bit to get those championship juices flowing. And it only just took some time for New York to get that handled. And they showed why they should probably be back in the finals this year.
Yeah, it's really cool to see the summer camp games. The WNBA is known for like those midweek matchups where it's like early afternoon or like late morning. And so it's fun to hear the kids get excited, but especially with a matchup this big, it felt a little bit unfortunate, especially since the entire 5-game slate was done by 4:30 Central, and so most people aren't out of work by that time, especially where we're at. So it's tough, but fun for the kids to be able to see. And I agree that New York, I think that we can tend to forget about them sometimes, which is weird to say because Minnesota's been really exciting. Las Vegas has struggled a little bit, but they have A'ja Wilson who can really carry a team on her own. And with the supporting pieces that she has around her, Las Vegas is going to be just fine. Connecticut too. They're probably one of the more quote unquote boring teams of the bunch, just because their contributors have been around for a while, but they just consistently perform really well. And it was good to see them, even though they fell behind in this game, to be able to come back and make it an exciting game. I think it just goes to show that if and potentially when these teams meet during the playoffs, it'll probably be an exciting series, even if it winds up being like a sweep one way or another. I think a sweep would be possible, but I think that all matchups would still be close in that case.
100%.
Before we move on to the next section, if you enjoy content like this, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. And as you can see at the bottom of the screen, rotowire.com/try will give you a chance to test out RotoWire's full slate of tools across all sports. So maybe you have a fantasy football draft coming up, you have fantasy baseball stuff that you're looking at. We have you covered for all of that. So check it out, see what we have to offer. This is a unique episode for players to add, as some of the players we'll talk about may only maintain fantasy relevant roles for a few more days because their teammates could get healthier during the Olympic break. However, one player who will likely have some staying power is Azura Stevens, forward for the Sparks. She missed the start of the season due to an arm injury, and Stephanie Talbot's injury has likely contributed to Stevens needing to make an immediate impact for LA. Stevens has played at least 26 minutes in each of her first 2 appearances of the season, and she's tallied exactly 26 fantasy points in each of those outings. It's not yet clear whether Talbot will be back before the Olympic break, but Stevens seems like a good candidate to remain productive once the season resumes in mid-August, making her one of my most intriguing pickups for this week.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said at the beginning, like it's a kind of a weird waiver wire time. But I think Stevens is a season long pickup. I think, she probably was like picked up earlier in like sharp leagues as soon as she was cleared, but there was a lot of uncertainty about like how many minutes she was going to play. But she doesn't appear like she has any limitations. 26 minutes in her debut, then she started the next game, played 28, has totaled nearly 20 points, 12 boards, 8 assists, 3 steals, 3 blocks, so all around production. Not many 3-pointers, but you can live with that. And like you said, with Brink out for the season, Stevens is a must roster player for the second half and for the playoffs.
Yeah, and you mentioned how in some sharp leagues she had probably been picked up. In some leagues where teams are a little bit more inactive, she might also be rostered because she was one of those players who was potentially drafted. She was like right on that brink, and because her return timetable wasn't really known at the time, so I know that I'm in a few leagues where the fantasy manager who just has stopped checking their team has Azura Stevens, and she's probably on their bench for the rest of the year, but to each their own. So if she is available, though, I think that she's probably one of the better long-term pickups at this point of the season.
For sure. I'm looking to, if for streaming purposes, I'm still looking to the Lynx. I said this on Monday's show about Tuesday's game. Collier is still expected to be outright. So Bridget Carlton, Dorka Uhash, and Cecilia Zandislini are all streamers for tonight's game against Seattle and Sunday's game versus Indiana. These 3 players, reserve role players, led Minnesota in ESPN fantasy points versus the Sparks on Tuesday. Uhash posted 29, Carlton with 27, and Zandislini with 21. So, you probably shouldn't be expecting that type of production, but you can really count on solid points from these 3 players, and probably you don't have enough room to stream all 3 of them. So in my opinion, I'm probably still rolling with Carlton at the top, Uhash second, and Zandislini third. But if one of them is available, I would definitely recommend trying to pick them up and steal some points. It's a semi-busy slate, but I in all of the leagues that I'm looking at, neither me or my opponent have like full like starting lineups tonight. So, plenty of opportunity, plenty of chances to steal, 15, 20 points. That could be the difference on Sunday.
Right. And I think that those fantasy point totals just go to show how much value there is in Minnesota while Collier is out, because the 3 players you mentioned, Carlton, Uhash, and Zandislini, they outscored Kayla McBride, Alana Smith, and Courtney Williams, who are I would say are bigger name fantasy players than all 3 of them. But Minnesota spreads the ball out quite a bit, and all of their players, even if they sometimes don't have the greatest upside outside of Collier, there's still a lot of production to go around. So I think that all 3 of them have value really as long as Collier is out. And even if Collier comes back at some point, she might be limited. So I think that all 3 of those are worth rostering ahead of the Olympic break.
Yeah, and I think Collier is doubtful for tonight, right? So then, Sunday, maybe she's questionable, and if she gets cleared, she's still limited. The other thing about like streaming these 3 reserve players is that like when Collier goes out, then Courtney Williams, Kayla McBride, Alana Smith, they get extra attention. So it limits their potential. You assume that they're the ones who are going to step up into the absence, and it's different with every team, but it feels like these 3 reserve players are going to get a big benefit of the doubt with Collier out.
Right. And I think a really underrated player that I just saw as I was looking at our team trends page with the ESPN fantasy points is Alyssa Peely. She's a rookie, and she really hasn't been a consistent part of the rotation this year, but she had 17 ESPN fantasy points during Tuesday's game against the Sparks. So I think that if you're in a really deep league and just looking for a dart throw for tonight, I think that Peely could be a solid option for you. A player who definitely seems like a short-term fantasy option is Mikiah Herbert Harrigan, forward for the Mercury. She's taken on a starting role over her last 2 appearances since Diana Taurasi has been sidelined, and that will likely continue Friday since Taurasi will remain out. Herbert Harrigan has recorded 2 blocks in each of her first 2 starts and has tallied 16 fantasy points Sunday against the Sparks before racking up 25 during Wednesday's game against Dallas. She was an unreliable fantasy option before this stretch and likely won't be a solid contributor once the Mercury are back to full health, but she's at least an intriguing short-term option who is rostered in just 1.1% of leagues. So chances are, if you're in any sort of league, Herbert Harrigan is available. So like Peely, Herbert Harrigan is someone who you can probably just add, and at least for tonight's game. And if it continues, great. If not, she can be dropped and you can find another streamer for next week.
Yeah, I think the big thing that jumps out to me about Harrigan is, like you said, the defensive production, but the more importantly, she's played 25 minutes in each of the last two games, so 29 minutes in this, 25 minutes last game, 29 minutes the previous game. That's a lot of time on the court. There's a lot of really good players surrounding her, so she should get some easier looks at the basket. Easier chances to like rack up some points when you aren't a star player and you are seeing 25 to 30 minutes. Like the other team is just going to give you more opportunities. I think this is a very solid play, but like you said, probably only limited value and short-term value.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm doing another 3-for-1. I'm turning to the aces. If you are looking for streaming options, like I said, it's the easiest way to steal some points. You should have at least one spot on your roster open for streaming. I'm looking at the aces with Tiffany Hayes, Alyssa Clark, and Kia Stokes. Vegas plays tonight, Friday against Atlanta, and Washington on Sunday. Las Vegas should have both these games in hand by the second half, allowing the starters probably maybe like a little extra rest before the Olympic break. Clark is probably the best bet among the three. She's scored ESPN double-digit fantasy points in 4 straight games. Tiffany Hayes probably has the higher upside, but her value is probably more tied to it being a blowout than the other two. And Stokes is the safest play, but probably the lowest upside. Like I said, blowout potential, so more minutes for the reserves. But even if these games are like semi-close, these players are getting consistent minutes and putting up solid production. And anytime you can stream a player on a really good offensive team that puts up a lot of stats, there's a lot of potential for ESPN fantasy points.
Yeah, and like TC mentioned in the comments, Tiffany Hayes is going to be playing against your old team tonight, so that should be a potential revenge game. But I think that with Alicia Clark and Kia Stokes, they're probably one of the more unique duos that I see in fantasy leagues, where Kia Stokes is the starter, but a lot of times in fantasy leagues, Alicia Clark is one of those players who you want to roster instead of her. Clark just is generally more productive. I think for real life, Becky Hammond just seems to prefer Kia Stokes as a starter with Clark off the bench, but both of them can certainly have that production along with Tiffany Hayes. TC also mentions that he sees that Shakira Austin is back practicing, which is true. She's been back in practice for a little while now, but I think that the Mystics just need more time before she's ready to come back. So especially with the long layoff coming up, it wouldn't surprise me to just see her out through the Olympic break and see if they can get some more consistency in her practice schedule and how she feels afterward during that break, and then regain her conditioning, maybe be able to contribute some down the stretch. But I don't think that she will be back before the Olympic break, unfortunately.
Yeah, 100%. Austin has like been in and out of like limited practices. It sounded like on Tuesday she was like, practicing more than she had been recently, but still not full go and definitely not close to game action yet, which is concerning. But it does sound like she's at least trending in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And TC also has a question. Would we pick up Satou Sabally and drop Brittney Sykes? He has that dilemma. If Satou Sabally is available, I would absolutely pick her up, even if you have to drop Brittney Sykes. Sykes is pretty productive whenever she's on the court, but Satou Sabally just has that upside that Sykes really can't match. And Sabally seems to have a more solid return timetable. We haven't heard a lot from the Wings about her since the start of the season, but they were pretty adamant before the year started that she would return after the Olympic break. Brittney Sykes, especially because of the way that Washington is a lot of times, it wouldn't surprise me, even if she's back after the Olympics, to see her with limited minutes. And I think that the Wings, even though the Wings and Mystics have a similar record, I think that the Wings are just one of those teams that feels like they should be in the playoffs more right now. They have more of that like win now talent. So I think that they'll be making more of a second half push. And Satou Sabally for me is definitely the better play.
Yeah, I don't know if you have a roster or a IR spot available, and Sykes is currently occupying it, and you would rather have Satou. Either way, even if it is just a regular roster spot, I think Sabally is the higher upside player on probably the better team with a better chance of coming back sooner. So I think that it's three, like a trifecta right there. Sabally is definitely the play.
Yeah, and also if your team is in a pretty good spot and you have like a player who hasn't really been contributing that much for your team, I would drop them and pick up Satu Sabally and try and keep both of them because especially with the long layoff, there will be a lot of time in which you don't have to worry about your fantasy lineup. So maybe you come back in mid-August and you have two really solid players on your team. So it really depends on where your team is at. I would feel comfortable dropping Brittney Sykes, but if you have another player that you could drop, I would do that. So one other player who's also worth discussing before the Olympic break is Odyssey Sims, guard for the Wings, who is now rostered in 47.1% of leagues. The Wings have been one of the most injury-plagued teams in the league this season, but it seems likely that Satou Sabally and potentially Maddie Siegrist will be back once the team resumes play in mid-August. However, Jaylen Brown's status remains unclear. Sims has logged at least 24 ESPN fantasy points in 6 of her 7 appearances for Dallas this season. So even with the post-Olympic break uncertainty, I think that I'm holding her through the break because her upside has simply just been there. And if she has even a portion of that afterward, I think that she's worth rostering. Would you take the same approach?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I said it on Monday's show. Sims is a long-term play for me until that production starts to drop. I'm riding with that production. I think Uzin and JC Sheldon have gotten their opportunities, but Sims has been by far the most productive player. You get Sabally, you get Brown back, Siegrist. How do things change? But arguably, Sims has been their best player, so I don't think that they want to go away from her. I do think there will be a drop in production, but Sims, to me, at this point, is a long-term play.
Yeah, I think that the Wings have seemed really impressed with Odyssey Sims since she has joined the team. So I think that they'll probably be looking for ways to keep her involved after the break as well.
My last waiver pickup streaming option is Myisha Hines-Allen, another player we've mentioned on the show a good chunk, a good amount, but still is not rostered in a ton of leagues. This is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 game stretch. I'm just going to count out the amount of fantasy points she scored. 18, 34, 23, 28, 17, 32, 14. For a player that you can literally be streaming right now, and I am streaming her in multiple leagues, it's just a fantastic, easy 15 to 25 to maybe 30 points. Some of those games, there were other players who missed some time, missed some games. Aaliyah Edwards was missing some times during that stretch, but Hines-Allen is carved out like a solid role, and she does a little bit of everything that she's going to give you consistent fantasy production. And there's no such thing as a sure thing, but Myisha Hines-Allen scoring like 15 fantasy points is about as sure of a thing as you can get, and a sure thing off the waiver wires is pretty gold at this point.
Yeah, and for as much as we've talked about Washington's injuries with Shakira Austin, Brittney Sykes, Myisha Hines-Allen is a player who had been a contributor for Washington in the past. She saw her role decline in recent seasons. And don't get me wrong, she's still been more inconsistent this year than she had been like during her prime. But has still displayed this season that like she can have that upside, and especially while she's having a starting role, she's been just a lot more consistent. Even her she's really developed a high floor in her starting role where even if she has an off night, she's still a decent fantasy contributor. She isn't one of those players who, whenever she's off, she's dropping like less than 5 points. She's still getting you like double digit fantasy points. So I would definitely consider Myisha Hines-Allen at this point. And before we move on, we have another viewer question from TC. Is Teaira McCowan good trade bait? He has Tina Charles and Azura Stevens already, and Satou Sabally is available. I think that McCowan's prime trade window has probably passed, but if you have a fantasy manager in your league who is interested in her and would be willing to give up even a relatively solid piece, that would be a good trade to make. McCowan is also someone who I would probably drop in order to pick up Satou Sabally, unless if you're on like the really playoff bubble and need a win this week and next week. I would just hold Satou Sabally and Brittney Sykes through the Olympic break and hope that they're back afterward. Teaira McCowan, I think, will still have glimpses of production, but she just hasn't had the same upside since the wings have gotten healthier. So I think Charles, Azura Stevens, Satou Sabally would be a really strong and fun front court to watch for after the Olympic break once we're back in action in mid-August.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. My only bit of information that I would add is that it's never a bad idea to have too many forwards, especially if this is an ESPN league. There's an extra forward spot, and so that it's always smart and nice to have an extra forward to a really like high upside forward to switch in and out of your lineup, so you don't have to go streaming. But I think you nailed it. I just think that when push comes to shove, I would want to have probably more than 3 forwards on my championship contending roster.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that we've reached that point in the season where if you look at your standings, you probably have an X or a Y or sometimes an E next to your name. If you have that X or Y, I would probably pick up Satou Sabally and drop Teaira McCowan. Thanks so much for that question. As we move on to the final section, this will be our last regular season show for a while, as the WNBA regular season will pause Wednesday ahead of the All-Star Game and Olympics. For me, one of my most intriguing matchups that I have circled in the near future before the season pauses is tonight's game between the Lynx and the Storm. Napheesa Collier will likely be sidelined once again, and the Lynx have won both of their games without her, but they've been against the Mystics and the Sparks, who are two of the teams that you'd probably want to see in that situation, even though they aren't like quote unquote easy opponents. The Storm should provide a tough matchup though, and it'll be interesting to see whether the rest of the Lynx can step up.
That was a really nice way to put that. Two of the teams that you would like to see when your best player is sidelined. Yes, two of the teams at the bottom of the standings. Like we've said all season, though, there's no easy games in the W, but I had to laugh at the way you put that. It was softened the blow. After a disappointing loss to the Mystics on Wednesday, Caitlin Clark just mentioned that loss. Caitlin Clark and the Fever are back in action this weekend. They have 2 really tough tests. They play Phoenix, who they did just beat on the road, and then they play Minnesota. These are 2 playoff teams, and we've kind of been talking about how the Fever are a team that could maybe make an upset, have it be an upset team in the playoffs, but they got to start winning some of those games now to like have that confidence when the playoffs come. So it should be a challenging test for a young Fever squad. Clark's playing really well, even though they dropped that game. The offense is playing a little bit better. Defense has to step up, especially against these 2 teams. Biggest question: will NaLyssa Smith start? Who knows what Christy Sides is thinking? If anybody wants an in-depth look at me and Jason's DMs during Fever games, it's a lot of me complaining about Christy Sides' decisions. I don't know why. I don't know. Clark didn't even touch the ball on the Fever's last possession of Wednesday's game. Doesn't seem like a good idea, but once again, no one pays me to be a basketball coach, so what do I know? I think the Fever are one of those teams. If they play to what they've like established over this last couple of months, probably, if they continue that in the second half, they should be a playoff team. But they got to at least win one of these 2 games and to get that confidence going ahead of the postseason.
Right, and the Fever have been really like polarizing on the court recently in terms of their play. They've either been like really bad, as we kind of saw in that first half of the game against the Mystics this past week, or they can be really good, as we saw in the second half of that game against the Mystics. And I think that they're still trying to find the right combination. Sometimes it can create some interesting combos, because I think that the starting 5 against the Mystics had only played together for 9 total minutes before that game. So I would hope that NaLyssa Smith is back in action at some point, just because of her talent, and I want to see the Fever be competitive. But I don't. Christy Sides, I guess, knows something that we don't. So I think that whatever they roll out, it's at least been more competitive recently, which is good to see if you're rooting for Indiana.
I do have to say there might have been some disciplining. I don't want to like assume anything, but Melissa Smith did end up playing 27 minutes, and so it might have just been like like you missed curfew on the team bus or something, like so you don't get to start. I hope that doesn't happen in professional sports. But it was just such a weird decision, especially against like Washington, who has like a pretty strong front court. To like bench one of your best front court players for a shooter didn't make much sense, but we're not here to question. We're just here to count fantasy points and tell you who's scoring the most fantasy points. And Melissa Smith still can do that and should do that if she's starting.
Yeah, absolutely. And quickly going back to the TC discussion, he said he dropped Monique Billings because her production slowed down. That is the move that I would make. I actually wouldn't drop Teaira McCowan for Satou Sabally because McCowan still has that solid upside, even though she can be more inconsistent. Monique Billings, I was confusing the two for a second there, but Billings is the player that I would drop. So that's a really good move, TC. So with us about to be off for a little over a month in terms of the show, what are some of the biggest storylines that you'll be watching from now until mid-August?
I think, just going back to those injuries, there's a couple other injuries too, but Shakira Austin and Collier are the two biggest in my mind. When will they be back? Will they be back? How many minutes will they play? We should get when with the Olympics actually coming, we should get some updates on when they're back with their teams. And then also you just got to watch the Olympics and see if there's any injuries during that, because that could also have a cascading avalanche type effect into the fantasy WNBA playoffs.
Yeah, and I think that some of these players, maybe they haven't quite been ready to play for their WNBA teams lately, but maybe they're ready to play for their national teams. So I think that this could provide a peek into where some of the players are at in their recovery processes, and hopefully we'll have most of the talent back in the league once the season resumes in mid-August, because there seem to be more prominent injuries than usual lately, and it's been good to it'll be good to see hopefully a strong second half surge.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep. That does it for our Friday show. As I alluded to earlier, we'll be off this Monday, and we will then take a break while the WNBA season is off. However, we may be back with a few shows before mid-August, so be sure to keep an eye on RotoWire's social media channels for updates. Thanks for watching.